Live from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe, welcome to the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, the first five-year National Development Strategy, or NDS-1, 2021 to 2025, lessons from the past, opportunities, priorities, and funding. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network, ZTN, and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, LEDRIS. Please also tune in to Economic Panorama on Capi Talk every Thursday at 7 p.m. Now, should you have any views or comments on our program this afternoon, please feel free to contact us via our Facebook page, Zimpaper's TV network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. Good afternoon, I'm Andy Hodges. In 2018, the government of Zimbabwe launched the Transitional Stabilization Program, or TSP, in a bid to set Zimbabwe's economy on a recovery path. The program, which ran from October 2018, comes to an end in December 2020. The TSP set in motion a number of infrastructure projects spanning across energy, roads, and social services such as water and health provision. It focused on stabilizing Zimbabwe's macroeconomy, laying a foundation for sustainable and shared private sector-led growth. The government is finalizing the development of the first five-year National Development Strategy, or NDS-1, which will succeed the TSP. The NDS-1 will set out priorities for our nation's sustainable development for the period 2021 to 2025. This program seeks to discuss lessons from the past, opportunities, priorities, and financing for the NDS-1. And to help us further discuss and interrogate this, we have an esteemed panel comprising of Prosper Chitambara. He's an economist from the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, LEDRIS. We have Sekai Kuvarika, Chief Executive Officer of the Confederation of Zimbabwe Industries, CZI. And joining us virtually is Janet Zhou. She's Executive Director of Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZimCOD. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Mint Special.
Thank you so much, Andy.
Now, Prosper, it is important, I think, to start with a clear diagnosis of the economic development challenges facing the country. So what, in your view, are and were the key binding constraints to economic growth and sustainable development in the country?
I think probably I would look at them from two perspectives. The first one being, obviously, the institutions, the role of institutions. I think what we've seen over time is the weakening of our key economic and political institutions. And as you know, institutions are very, very important in terms of inspiring confidence, in terms of providing the right incentives as well as the right disincentives to discourage wrong behavior. So as a result of the weakening of institutions, we've seen a lot of ill discipline, financial indiscipline, even also fiscal indiscipline. We have seen a lot of even consumption orientation. So I think we've tended also to focus on consumption as opposed to production. Then the second level, it's really a gross underfunding and underinvestment in what I call critical productivity enhancing sectors, as well as poverty reducing sectors. Obviously, like your infrastructure, we have a huge infrastructure gap or deficit, which was estimated by the African Development Bank at around 15 billion per annum. So we also haven't been investing adequately in sectors that enhance productivity, like the healthcare, for example. So from that perspective, I think it becomes a challenge to then grow the economy sustainably without first enhancing the local capacity of the economy. So I think those two levels are important for us to really look at: institutions and also investments.
All right, Mr. Kai, you've heard Prosper there. Obviously, role of institutions, focus on consumption, underfunding in key sectors, particularly infrastructure. And of course, I'm surprised he didn't mention inflation and exchange rates. But anyway,
I didn't mention it because we've seen some measure of stability owing to some of the reforms.
But let's get there.
That's a key challenge.
It's a key one. So anyway, any additions to what Prosper has said there?
I think I would like to concur with him, and I think one of the inherent things in a weak economy or in a struggling economy is the weakening of institutions. You know, they sort of feed on each other as well. And this is really across the institutional spectrum. It's not just government institutions. You are looking at your macroeconomic institutions, the meso level and the micro level institutions as well. So I just want to concur with him.
Janet Zhou, Executive Director of ZimCOD, welcome to the Mint Special.
Thank you, Andy.
Janet, I just also want you to touch on that in terms of identifying the key binding constraints to economic growth. I think one area, of course, which ZimCod is very involved in is debt and debt management. So maybe you could expand and sort of tell us some of your views in terms of what were our constraints as a Zimbabwean economy.
Yes. Thank you very much, Andy. And I want to link it to what Prosper was talking about, the macroeconomic instability. And the push then for a debt-led economy because of the limited fiscal space, constricted fiscal space that we have continued to have under the Transitional Stabilization Program. So this meant that the government continued to heavily rely on the domestic market in terms of borrowing to finance some of the projects, to finance its budget as well in some of the projects. That if sometimes you look at them, some of them would be quasi-fiscal. So within the TSP, we have to look at the issue of the debt going beyond even the legally provided for thresholds that are in the Public Debt Management Act, in the RBZ Act in terms of at the domestic level, that we don't, the 25% threshold that we normally have. We have gone beyond even the regional threshold. So the issue of debt management and clearance of arrears, which was a key issue under the Transitional Stabilization Program, was missed. So I must speak to that as a major constraint in terms of economic recovery or stability, which is what the TSP was focusing on.
Right.
But
Now,
I just wanted to...
Yeah. Now, Janet, now in the pre-budget strategy paper, the government provided a summary of achievements made under the TSP. I want to look at social protection initiatives. Now, they had a whole list of them, and I'm just going to pick a few. These included drought mitigation, sustainable livelihood, support to disabled people, harmonized social cash transfers, support to elderly persons and children in difficult circumstances, and health assistance. The socio-economic context, however, remains very challenging. For instance, extreme poverty increased from 29% in 2018 to 34% by the end of 2019. This, of course, is expected to worsen under COVID-19. So in your opinion, were these government interventions successful? Do they provide an adequate safety net for citizens and the most vulnerable in our society?
Thank you for that question, Andy. So with the Transitional Stabilization Program, it was focusing on austerity. So what this meant is that there was going to be cuts in social spending. There was going to be increase in taxes as the government tried to increase its taxes. So we saw, for example, the 2% tax amongst other taxes that have been introduced by the government. And these have got an impact in terms of the livelihood of people, or of the people of Zimbabwe, particularly those that are vulnerable. Talk about your youth, talk about your women and the like. So already disposable incomes were diminished. The government reduced its social spending so that it could achieve fiscal balance. And though it tried in terms of putting in place of social safety net, I think the issue then that we have to ask is the quality of the social safety net. We should be talking about the poverty data line. In terms of the social safety nets that are provided for. Are they going to be meaningful to address or to at least be able to provide for the basics that a family needs? Are they able to ignite growth and productivity and development if you're talking about entrepreneurship? So those are some of those questions and deficiencies in terms of the quality of the flanking social policies that we put in place to cushion people from the shocks of the austerity.
Okay, thank you, Janet.
I want to talk about the creation of jobs. Yes, just as I conclude, because there's a jobs issue.
Right.
It's also on the quality of jobs, Andy. We talk about decent work and the decent work agenda under the International Labour Organization, and there are 4 pillars. Yes, employment creation, rights at work, social protection, and issues of social dialogue. How were these supported under the TSP? So these are some of those issues that we have to look at, the quality of our jobs, the quality of employment that we churned out under the TSP as we move forward to the NDS. I think these are key issues and critical issues and deficiencies that we have to be addressing.
Thank you, Janet. Sakai, specific programs geared towards industry were also mentioned as achievements under the TSP. I'm just going to mention a couple. The launch of the Zimbabwe National Industrial Development Policy, agro-based industrialization, Zimbabwe produced goods on shelves for supermarkets, and improved on the World Bank ease of doing business from 156 to 140. So what specific specifically do you believe the TSP achieved for business?
Thanks, Andy. I think I'll start by making reference to one of the statements that Janet has just mentioned in terms of the TSP's ability to generate outcomes around jobs and social protection. I think we need to also take into consideration the fact that this TSP was in a period of decline for the productive sector in almost all sectors. I think the mining sector was in decline, the agriculture sector was in decline, and manufacturing was also in decline at that particular time. And I think the main focus of the TSP was really well espoused in its name. It was a transitional stabilization program. So I think our expectations in terms of what it could actually achieve for industry in particular, what we were desperate for was some stabilization that can create a good launchpad to begin to even think about medium to long-term sort of strategy for business. And then I'll move on to speak about some of the things that the TSP actually did achieve for industry. The limitations are noted in terms of the things that it could not achieve because of the limited fiscal space, of course, and also, you know, the narrowing tax base, which is because of the increasing informality as well in the economy. So the formal sector was shrinking and the informal sector was expanding. But the growth of the informal sector does not come with revenue to fund social sector programs, which is unfortunate as well. I would say, you know, one of the key problems that we faced were huge distortions in the economy, price distortions that were at the back of unsustainable subsidies, and I think some quasi-fiscal activities as well at the central bank. Then, if you look at the affected grain, they affected your fuel. I think it affected the provision of electricity as well. So we were running on subsidized electricity, but that subsidy was not funded from the central government. You know, it was then something that is borne by the utility itself. You know, the utility is not able to increase rates for electricity in line with the actual cost of providing that electricity, but that gap is then not funded from central government to the utility. So what happens is that it incapacitates the utility at the end of the day, and then you end up with a situation where you have a shortage of supply of energy. So I think the interventions in that space in terms of removing distortions and retiring some of the most hurting subsidies that were causing some of these distortions was a huge step in the right direction for the TSP, I would say.
Okay. Prosper, you know, the government again in the pre-budget strategy document looked at the financial sector deposit mobilization. And more importantly, of course, the introduction of the foreign currency auction system has resulted in some measure of stability in the exchange rate and foreign exchange markets, as well as on the inflationary front, thereby providing an important basis for growing the economy. I mean, couple this with reported budget surpluses and an estimated $1.2 billion current account surplus projection for December 2020 on the back of a 33% increase in diaspora remittances. So your comments on this, were these in your opinion successes? And can you identify very briefly, because we do have to take a breather, any failures?
I think there were successes, but from conversations with ordinary citizens, there seems to be a serious disconnect between the nominal numbers in terms of our fiscal surplus, in terms of our current account surplus, and also the lived reality of the person on the ground. And obviously that's caused by the fact that on account of austerity, we have seen massive cutbacks in critical social sectors, which has directly negatively affected the welfare of the ordinary citizen. So yes, in nominal terms, there are successes, and obviously we need to build on that. And also, more importantly, we need to begin to mobilize domestic savings. When you look at our savings to GDP numbers for the past 20 years, we have been in negative territory. Look at countries that are doing well. China, since 1978, they've averaged around 35% savings to GDP.
But isn't that really a combination of good interest rates? Because people aren't going to put into their money into a bank. Stability.
Yeah, of the
you don't put your money in at 3% when inflation is at 600.
That's the challenge. Yeah. So how do we stabilize the economy, and how do we come up with the right kind of incentives to mobilize these domestic savings.
Thank you. Now, we will have to take a short breather. If you have any comments or views on our shows this afternoon, please contact us via our Facebook page and Papers TV Network or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. You're watching the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, the first 5-year National Development Strategy, NDS1, 2021 to 2025, lessons from the past, opportunities, priorities and financing. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network and our partners, Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, LEDRIS. Now, after the breather, we asked our panelists, what lessons can we draw from the TSP? What about institutional reform prioritization, and what sectors need to be ring-fenced under the National Development Strategy 1? The Mint Special will be right back. Don't go away. Welcome back. This is the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, the first 5-year National Development Strategy, NDS1, 2021 to 2025. Lessons from the past, opportunities, priorities, and financing. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, LEDRIS. Please also tune in to Economic Panorama on Capitalk every Thursday at 7 p.m. Prosper, what key lessons, in your view, can be drawn from the Transitional Stabilization Program era to enhance the effectiveness of the implementation of the soon-to-be-launched National Development Strategy 1?
The first one, obviously, is the need to institutionalize the involvement and the participation of all the key stakeholders, the citizens, the CSOs, business, labor. Because we didn't see that when the TSP was actually introduced in 2018. So I think it's important to ensure there is buy-in, to ensure that there is effective participation of everyone in terms of the crafting, in terms of the implementation, as well as in terms of the monitoring and evaluation of policies. Then number two, the issue, obviously, of institutions, I think it's also very important. But equally important is the need to have a good balance between your economic indicators and targets on the one hand, and also your social and development indicators on the other end. With TSP, I think we may overly focused on just the economic indicators, the economic targets. When you look at the 3 broad benchmarks in terms of the targets, they were largely speaking to economic issues. We didn't focus enough attention on issues of employment creation, for example, which is now very, very important. When you look at how other countries are now doing their macroeconomic policy management, they are placing equal emphasis between either price stability growth on the one end and also employment creation as well as social protection on the other end. It's called the GEO mandate macroeconomic policy framework. So I think going forward, we need to be targeting these social and development indicators so that at least we ameliorate those poverty numbers that we say are actually going up. Mm-hmm. So we need to focus a lot on issues and sectors that enhance the well-being and the welfare of the ordinary person.
Janet, you heard Prosper there. He talked about citizens' involvement, buy-in by all, which is critical. These are lessons to be learned. And also, the TSP mostly seem to focus on economic targets. Your comment on what we can learn from the TSP.
Yes, thank you very much, Andy, for that question. And I think Prosper has touched on the issue of the critical stakeholder involvement. But I think in Zimbabwe as well, taking from the TSP and previously, where our major shortfall in terms of our economic blueprints is also the fundability of those economic blueprints and the commitment, the political commitment actually to ensure that what we do put on black and white, we implement it. I think that is very key and important. So we can talk about how far did we go in terms of curbing corruption, plugging all the loopholes that have facilitated leakages. But I wanted to say that as we move on to the NDS as well, one of the key lessons that we should be learning from the TSP is that we should be making effort on systematically exploring and spending time on futures and on blueprints that focus on transforming lives, that focus on transformative economies and not just on gut feeling and what we would want to do. So I think I want to talk to the issue of revisiting our economic model in terms of austerity, in terms of private sector-led growth that we mainly focused on under the TSP. I think going forward, we need to think activist. I think our government needs to be activist. We need a democratic developmental state that puts in place social policies, economic policies that put the person at the center of the economic recovery that we are looking at achieving, and so that we escape the current socio-economic crisis that we are facing. So I think these are some of those key issues that I think we should be learning going forward. What are the small things? What are the small steps that we need to take to transform the livelihoods at the basic level?
I like that. Thank you, Janet. Sakai, talking about putting citizens at the whole center of any economic recovery plan. Also, of course, two very important issues: curbing corruption and trying to stop loopholes, plugging loopholes in the system to stop leakages. Anything else you would like to add to the lessons learned?
I think I'll add, maybe for me, it's two lessons. One is, just a recognition of the centrality of industrial development to any successful economy in the world. I think whatever economic blueprint that we may come up with must put industrialization at the center of everything, because we cannot talk about creating jobs if industrialization is not at the center of our blueprints. We cannot talk about improving the quality of livelihoods of our people if industrialization is not at the center, because that is what really turns the wheels of the economy, if you may. I think for me, in terms of the TSP, while it was really focusing on stabilization, I would have expected more deliberate measures towards driving industrialization, even in difficult circumstances where you are saying things are difficult, but we can't do without, So I think it's non-negotiable that we need policies that put industrialization at the center. Otherwise, we will focus on short-term relief that comes maybe from extractive industries or primary industries that then in the long run keep us where we are, and then we don't advance with industrialization and we continue to get left behind. So that's the lesson that I take into the NDS for that, and that has really informed most of our submission and input into the NDS to drive industrial transformation as a key basis for transforming the economy. The second lesson I would like to share is on policy impact analysis and regulatory impact analysis. I mean, we do speak to orientation towards competitiveness and ease of doing business, but I don't think we do enough policy impact analysis so that we are able to measure our policies and our regulations against how they have made us more competitive or less so, or how they've stimulated more economic activity or less, or whatever. So I don't see us doing that. So you'll find that at the end of the TSP, I do note that the ministry did go around communicating some of the achievements of the TSP, but what you would have expected is periodic evaluations that are well communicated as well, so that we start the next policy on the basis, I get the sense, I may be wrong, that we sort of usually start the next policy cycle almost like we are starting, you know, assuming that we achieved what we achieved everything that we wanted to achieve. And the preamble doesn't really tell you that in the last policy cycle, we had these shortcomings, and this is where we have to, because we can't say because they are not achieved, they are no longer relevant. And I would like to add also the one issue. I know my colleagues are talking about involvement and participation. I think for me, I do acknowledge the need for that, but I think one other bigger thing is the issue of policy communication, you know.
Communication is key,
policy communication,
yeah. It's important. It gets the buy-in, doesn't it?
Yes, yes. Policy communication, you know, throughout intentions of a policy process, how do we engage the different publics? You know, how do we engage the different segments of society? What does a TSP mean to me? If I'm a vendor in town, what does a TSP mean to me? If I'm an industrialist, what does it mean to me if I'm in the village? So I think that one of the areas that that should be considered in the NDS is really policy communication.
I mean, we did a survey of citizens on the streets, and when we asked them, do you know what the TSP is? I think 9 out of 10 had no idea what it was.
Yeah.
Prosper, very briefly.
I was going to add and say that we also need a clear implementation matrix in terms of the NDS, and also a clear monitoring and evaluation framework to be able to measure some of the benchmarks that would have been identified in the targets. And also back to basics in terms of the industrialization policy, what we need to focus on, I think, is import substitution. So at least we enhance our local capacity.
I'm going to get to that. I'm going to get to that a bit later. Janet, institutions. I think you heard Prosper earlier in the first segment talk about the strengthening of institutions as critical, and institutions have been identified as being the key missing link in many developing economies. So, what kind of institutional reforms do you think must be prioritized under the NDS 1?
Yes, thank you very much, Andy. I think one of the key issues is that we have to look at our public institutions, like you have highlighted. I think I have highlighted as well that we're focused mainly on reviving the private sector-led growth, but we also need to be thinking about public sector-led growth, and how do we do that? I think our institutions have to address the issue of efficient use of resources at the national level and plug all illicit financial flows or the leakages that are taking place within our public institutions. I think that is one key issue in terms of those institutions that provide services. For example, your water, your electricity, health, and the like. But we also have to deal with institutions in terms of strengthening our oversight institutions. So that's our parliament, that's our Office of the Auditor General, that's our Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, amongst others. I think we should be looking at how are we going to strengthen those to ensure that all our resources begin to address the key critical issues in the social sector, social investments, and the like that we have to deal with. And I think the other thing is that we need to be building on the institutions that will allow for devolution. I think we need to put in place institutions that will devolve in terms of service delivery, in terms of fiscal devolution, and ensure that the government and the economy is taken to the lower levels and start responding to the issues that are affecting people on the ground or at the lower levels. So for me, I think what I want to see are institutions that are empowering, institutions that will ensure that there's self-sufficiency amongst the citizens, institutions that will allow for investments by the locals and by our entrepreneurs, institutions that are sensitive in terms of gender issues, in terms of youth issues, in terms of our informal sector. So I think we need to be putting institutions that ensure that we give a people-centered outlook going forward. I think that those are key issues that we have to deal with.
In fact, Janet took me into my next question, Sakai, because and she did mention a couple of sectors there, but like any key development plan, key sectors in the economy need to be prioritized. So in your opinion, what sectors do you feel need to be ring-fenced and prioritized in the NDS 1, sectors that can make the greatest impact on economic growth? One that jumps to mind, of course, is small and medium enterprises, if I have to look at our economy as it is currently.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I do believe that we really need to promote small and medium enterprises. But we also have to recognize that, small and medium is the size of enterprise. But we have sectors, we have agro-processing, we do have the iron and steel and engineering, we do have leather
industry.
and furniture and other. So my take on that is that I think we need to look at the sectors that are likely to have a transformative impact. If you look at the objectives stated in the NDS is economic structural transformation. So for me, the key word there is transformation. So whatever we are going to do about industrial development has to be transformative. And when we are talking now about transformation, we are talking about moving our economy up the value chain, as stated in the NDS, of course, as well. And we are also talking about producing more complex products than we produce at the moment, and also being able to then export more complex products because they create better quality jobs and they also perform better in the export markets. And the sectors that we have identified using the product space map and the complexity rankings, where we are not doing very well globally at the moment, and this relates to the countries with more complex products have higher GDP than those with less complex products. I think the key industries that we found there were the agro-processing industries. So we have a lot to do in terms of pushing the agro-processing industries, as well as the metal and iron and steel industries, as well as the leather.
These are key industries that we can promote.
That we can promote, So those are some of the key ones.
Prosper, I'd like you to comment on that. We have a couple of minutes before we have to get to a breather. I'd like you to comment on that, but also maybe briefly key lessons, because other African countries, of course, have gone through such transformation programs and national development strategies. Key lessons that we can draw and glean from other countries that have done this.
I think an important lesson is obviously the need to upscale your investments, and one opportunity that's there is how we can actually harness the private sector, not just the local private sector, but also even the foreign private sector through public-private partnerships that could go a long way in terms of minimizing that financing gap, that infrastructure gap, and also obviously the role of the diaspora. We've seen the diaspora playing a more critical developmental role in countries such as Ethiopia, in Nigeria. Ethiopia, actually, a few years ago, they issued an infrastructure diaspora bond that was oversubscribed. So they're actually harnessing and leveraging the diaspora.
It's an opportunity for us, isn't it?
It is. Well, 3 million Zimbabweans that are in the diaspora.
And you look at the numbers, I mean, it's driving our current account surplus, 33% inflows. In fact, they've gone up during COVID, in fact.
So then also the agriculture, again, that's a key sector that we need to prioritize in terms of climate-proofing our agriculture. So we need to be investing in irrigation. We also need to undertake institutional reforms in agricultural sector so that we strengthen and reform our land tenure and private property rights in agriculture.
Well, I suppose the upcoming land bank may look at some of those issues.
The land bank becomes very critical, because financing is one of the key enablers in terms of the agricultural sector.
And that's great. It takes us to our next segment. But now we'll have to take a short breather. You're watching the MINT Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, the first 5-year National Development Strategy, NDS1, 2021 to 2025. Lessons from the past, opportunities, priorities, and financing. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Paper's TV network, ZTN, and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, LEDRIS. In our final segment, we ask, how will the National Development Strategy be financed? Can the government put in place effective domestic resource mobilization strategies? And we ask our panelists their views on what we should expect in the National Development Strategy 1 to be launched next week. Don't go away, the MINT Special will be right back.
Life will never be the same again.
Absolutely. How do you tell someone in Mbaria or in Soweto that they should exercise social distancing?
Every single one of us, barring a few, are praying more.
What is the health economic cost of what we are trying to achieve?
I don't know whether his chairman knows he runs at about 9 in the morning.
I've just got symptoms, so I just called the doctor and and then he just advised me to have to stay at home,
Welcome back. You're watching the Mint Special, Economic Panorama. Our discussion this afternoon, the first five-year National Development Strategy, NDS1, 2021 to 2025. Lessons from the past, opportunities, priorities, and financing. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, LEDRIS. Please also tune in to Economic Panorama, live on Capi Talk every Thursday at 7 p.m. Prosper, it is no secret that Zimbabwe is suffering from a very tight fiscal space. The government, obviously, putting it simply, just doesn't have enough money to adequately finance all their programs they would like to roll out. So what options do you believe are available for sustainable financing of the National Development Strategy 1?
Yeah. So when we talk about sustainable financing, I think we need to be relying more on domestic resource mobilization. But obviously that's a key challenge when we look at the high levels of informality that have resulted in a shrinking of the tax base. So I think there's going to be a lot of re-engineering, a lot of reprioritization in terms of our expenditures. We may need to move away from some non-productive expenditures towards non-productive towards productive expenditures. We also need, earlier on I talked about the role that the diaspora could play, the role that public-private partnerships could play, and also we need to be innovative in terms of even coming up with other taxes that will not necessarily affect businesses. Other countries have done it. South Africa, I know 2 years ago, they introduced what they call a sugar tax as a way of mobilizing resources to finance a national health insurance scheme. So South Africa, they've introduced a national health insurance scheme that's funded 100% through that 20% tax on sugar. And that's very, very critical for Zimbabwe, because when you look at Zimbabwe, only 3% of Zimbabweans have access to social security, and only 7% of Zimbabweans have access to medical insurance. So the issue of public health financing becomes very, very critical.
So we need
and some of those innovative taxes that don't harm too much the private sector, but will also, because with the sugar tax, for example, you're also discouraging the consumption of sugary beverages, which is good in terms of checking the spread of non-communicable diseases. And also, obviously, mobilizing additional resources.
I will say for Zimbabwe,
they've done it in other countries, Asia. It has worked in Asia.
Zimbabweans do have sweet tooth, so we'll have to see how that tax comes in. Janet,
also corrective taxes,
syntaxes, syntaxes, of course, they always hit alcohol and tobacco, which is the usual. Janet, let me come to you. You've heard there Prosper talking about domestic resource mobilization, but donor funding and facilities from such organizations as Afreximbank and the African Development Bank seem to have been critical for the government to partly bridge its financing gap. Commentators allege, however, that this is unsustainable and other methods of financing, especially as we've mentioned, as Prosper has said, domestic resource mobilization, need to be found. What is your comment on that?
I cannot agree more, Andy, on that issue. And I think going into the NDS and even starting with this 2021 budget, I think our government needs to address the growing inequalities in Zimbabwe. Like we spoke about the vulnerabilities that continue to increase. And we cannot depend on the international community. I think COVID-19 has taught us that we have to build our own strong national value chains in terms of production and providing for our citizens. So domestic resource mobilization is the key and fundamental alternative to international financing. So our tax revenue has to grow. And we are even suggesting they must be, on top of the taxes that Prosper is suggesting, a wealth tax. There are wealthy Zimbabweans that are flashing their wealth. Why is it possible for us to start to initiate conversations or even implement a wealth tax, for example, so that we can distribute resources? We can roll out social grants for the vulnerable in Zimbabwe. Vulnerable because of COVID-19, yes, but vulnerable to climate change issues that have increased vulnerabilities as well. So depending on the international community, that is also facing its own challenges that have been brought about by COVID-19, but also I think globally, the global financial system is also facing its own challenges, is going to be suicidal. So we have to think domestic resource mobilization, how to curb illicit financial flows, how to tax the wealthy, how to increase our tax base by targeting corporates, the multinational companies that are coming, the companies that are coming. We are luring investment. We are talking about Zimbabwe is open for business, but we should be watchful that we do not end up giving a harmful tax incentives, but we should be taxing actually so that we distribute the resource. So I think domestic resource mobilization is going to be key as we move forward.
Right. Sakai, you know, you heard there Janet talking about tax revenue needs to grow. Of course, it's like a chicken and egg, isn't it? It's a vicious circle. You need to increase production, industrialization, you need to create jobs to increase your tax base, bring more informal sector into the formal economy and so forth. But one major area that Zimbabwe requires to build upon, of course, is to increase production. I think you mentioned this, particularly in industry. Increase production of local products, import substitution to reduce our import bill, beneficiation, of course, to increase the value we see from Zimbabwe exports, and of course, let's not forget about retooling, which is vital for industry. So do you think that these should be prioritized in the NDS-1? And of course, the million-dollar question, how can they be funded?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and I think you know, I get a little bit nervous when we begin to talk about taxes because we are being taxed to death at the moment, and we must also understand that you know, maybe repurposing some of the existing taxes rather than introducing new taxes should be considered, because you know, we introduce temporary taxes in this country and then they just become permanent. You know, they never really go away, like the IMMT tax, and you know. So I think we should also think about repurposing some of those taxes, whether what they were put in place for is still a requirement, revisiting some of the maybe some of the indirect taxes that we already have on business, and see whether they should still be deployed that way or could be deployed otherwise. I also think that I mean, taking cognizance of the limitations in financing production in this country, it is important that the government and industry and all players take a very deliberate buy local approach. We pay taxes, and some of that tax revenue from industry is actually used in public procurement to finance public procurement. So it only makes sense that some of that money is revolved back to industry by government actually purchasing whatever they are buying from industry. That way you are actually financing, you are actually refinancing industry.
If I'm not mistaken,
business.
I think across the border in South Africa they've introduced something like that,
Yes,
where they've made it a law that government must procure a percentage from locally,
yes.
which makes sense.
Yeah.
Janet, I have to ask you to be brief because we are coming to the end of our program, but COVID-19, of course, has highlighted the need for our economy to be more sustainable, resilient, diverse, and innovative. How can these principles or values be mainstreamed in the National Development Strategy 1?
Yeah, so I think the issue is accepting that it is possible to be pro-growth and inclusive at the same time. There's no point in trying to pursue one path over another. I think let us talk about, like I indicated earlier, on the democratic developmental state. We can develop, we can have growth, but we can also target being inclusive, so that we know that poverty is feminized, we know it is a youth face, we know it is a person with disability face, and all that. So it is to ensure that we address all those issues and know that what we want, yes, is growth. What we want is, yes, to get to 2030, Vision 2030, but that does not necessarily mean that we would have achieved inclusive growth. So the questions that the NDS must be answering to are issues of inclusivity, are issues of eradicating and ending poverty, are issues of productivity and ensuring that we have stability and public sector-led growth and not debt-led growth, not only focusing on the private aspects and the indicators that will say, yes, we have reached there, but leaving so many people behind. And I think we have a framework at the international level. The Sustainable Development Goals can be a framework that we target as we move forward so that we leave no one behind.
Thank you.
I think at the African Union level, we also have our Agenda 2063. Those are frameworks that we could use, that we could domesticate and take some of those good things that we can put in our national development strategy.
In fact, Janet, thank you. You've actually sort of answered my last question, which I'll now pose to my two panelists here in studio. A wish list. If I had to say to you, give me a wish list, unfortunately we are coming to the end of our program, what would you wish to see? Let me start with you, Sakai. What would you wish to see included in the National Development Strategy NDS-1 that runs from 2021 to 2025? Just a wish list.
I think for me, it's really clarity on the centrality of industrial development. If that can come out clearly in the NDS, it will send a message of intention and deliberate focus on industrialization. I also would like to see a deliberate and very bold approach to business regulatory environment reform, you know, so that we create a competitive business environment. And bold because I know it costs money. Yeah, it has revenue implications, but you know the return on losing that money is bigger than what we are generating for regulatory authorities with a constrained industry.
Thank you. Prosper, very briefly, wish list.
I would want to see clear targets, targeting employment creation, targeting poverty reduction. And I also want to see probably the government fully embracing the digital economy, because I believe that's a low-hanging fruit, and that could go a long way in terms of dealing with issues of corruption and also in terms of simplifying the ease of doing business.
Well, we have come to the end of our program this afternoon. You've been watching the Mint Special Economic Panorama. Our discussion, the first 5-year National Development Strategy, NDS1, 2021 to 2025, lessons from the past, opportunities, priorities, and financing. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, LEDRIS. Don't of course, forget to miss Economic Panorama. That's live on Capi Talk every Thursday at 7 p.m. I believe Prosper is probably one of the guests on that show. Right, I'd like to thank our panelists, Prosper Chitambara, economist from the Labour and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe, LEDRIS, Janet Zhou, Director of Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZIMCOD, and Sekai Kubarika, Chief Executive Officer of the Confederation of Zimbabwe Industries. Thank you very much for appearing on the Mint Special. Janet?
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Thank you, Janet. A final comment. It is clear, and even the Zimbabwean government acknowledges, that a lot more still needs to be done to improve both public and private investments in critical productivity-enhancing and poverty-reducing sectors of the economy, such as health, education, agriculture, water and sanitation, and infrastructure. This is vital in ensuring that any future growth pattern is pro-poor, inclusive, employment-intensive, and sustainable. In this regard, it is important to ensure that explicit employment and poverty targets are mainstreamed in all the macroeconomic investment and development policies. Employment creation must also be an explicit monetary policy objective alongside price stability. Employment creation is very important in the fight against poverty, as it provides an important link between economic growth and poverty reduction. It is also critical that all of Zimbabwean citizens buy into any national policy initiatives and be involved in their formulation. Together we achieve much more than we are if we are apart, and that is just a fact. Zimbabwe waits to see what will be contained in the National Development Strategy 1. It cannot be overemphasized how important this document is, as it will be the blueprint to Zimbabwe's economic prosperity for at least the next 5 years. In fact, the theme of the strategy says it all: towards a prosperous and empowered upper middle income society by 2030. I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and you all be safe.